that's the quick overview of what I'm doing and working on. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments. I'm happy to show you other things. So, thank you.
This last format you showed, I don't know if you called it OI.
OI. Yeah.
OI. So when you mentioned format, would it be a separate format than the MP3? Someone would buy, they'd actually have to buy the song, and then they would buy a separate purchase for this separate format. It wouldn't possibly be one that you get everything needed.
Well, it could be, because it will give you the audio, it will give you the video, it gives you the stems, it gives you the lyrics.
But it might have the MP3 or.
Well, the thing is with the format is quality agnostic. So this actually, you could roll out 44.1, 16-bit with it if that's what you wanted to do, to work with it. Or you could send out MP3, whatever. I mean, the format is agnostic to quality. It's similarly to the way that YouTube works. You could have any quality of audio embedded within a YouTube video. But like for this project with Universal, in that they're looking at it as a separate stream. So actually within the education environment that this is being rolled out to, they've actually agreed that new songs released in this format will be available to kids and teachers 3 days before it goes live on iTunes, for example. It's a way of building that, because they're also interested in finding ways of getting their music in front of kids. So the education environment that's going out around it is one way for them to do it.
So in giving, let's say, a new generation of music listeners and consumers access to this layer that's generally been hidden to music consumers, how do you see that, or do you have ideas about how that might affect then the way in which music is produced going forward? If people can actually recognize techniques or have opinions on this mix versus that mix.
Sure. Well, for me, it's about how can we develop more critical listeners that are more aware of the processes that go that. I'm raising awareness of quality of audio formats and things like that. But to do that, you have to, if you think about the majority of people, they're listening to music in the background. It's not necessarily an active thing, but what if we were able to develop really engaging tools that got them into that? Now, you still have this kind of gap between, okay, I'm a generic fan and I get this. What do you mean pressing this, muting and soloing this track? What's going on here? I don't know what that is. So that was the whole reason for having that additional, that you didn't see in this alpha version, this story with somebody who's involved in the production actually walking you through how to do that. And the whole broader educational perspective on that is that this gets pushed out into the classrooms. And there's materials in there so that the teachers and the students are learning how to do it at home through the Artist of the Month. And then they're wanting to convert their entire MP3 collection to this interactive format so they can start to work with that. So you have to embed the education about the tool around the tool and around the multi-track. And that's kind of our thinking around it. So it could very well change some things, but we don't know. I don't know. It's an open question. Yeah?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the impact that these initiatives are having in terms of bringing more people, engaging more people into music. Have you quantified or
We haven't quantified it yet with that. These tools in general, though. So with Noteflight, for example, with the online music notation, they've crossed, I think, they're in the hundreds of thousands of scores now, online. The majority of them are youth-created scores. You look at Scratch, the environment that they put up there, which is only now a little over 5 years old, has 3.5 million student-created projects on it. Many of them, over half of them, with music-related embeds. Maybe it's just an MP3, maybe it's a sound effect, but that's one of the reasons why we're trying to develop these higher-level music blocks so that they're able to do more interactively with music. And then here, we don't know yet because it's just going to be released in October. So.
But I guess that's where we're going with this is like, if you think of it, you're in a music education program.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a clear narrative towards leading about the thinking about how we train music people and how we offer music education in schools and there. So how do you see all of that connecting with the education? What role do you think you would play in that particular?
Sure. Well, I mean, for me and what happens within the research group, it's the meta level kind of look at this is researching processes of experience design and figuring out how kids make sense of make meaning with music and share music, and how can we as educators better connect to that and develop pedagogies around that. So part of this is through this, the incubation of some of these projects and things within the group is that we end up developing better processes for designing software and technologies and hardware that will engage students and teach them and learn more and enable them to learn. So I don't know if that's fully answered. I mean, a lot of it for me is still very exploratory and figuring out, the research side of it is in meaningful engagement and in experience design and what are those things that we can learn from in here that we could then put out to classrooms and give to teachers as ways of engaging their kids with it.
So one of the contrasts that I see between the kinds of projects that are here, I've been delivering, and music making that's usually part of this education, is that music education classes usually involve group music making. So it's a collective social behavior. It involves listening to each other and also knowing rules and so on, but it is done together.
Yep.
A lot of these projects are about a person making a cool thing,
Yep.
which can be very rewarding and very enlightening. But how do some of these projects allow for different kinds of collaborations among students?
Yeah, I mean,
Like what?
to me it goes back to, so there's a couple replies. To me it goes back to, again, if we take this broader vision of where music education is, in that more and more people are learning and teaching themselves not in a formal classroom with others. So part of it is around how can we develop better tools to enable that more organic, self-initiated learning kind of thing and facilitate that with social tools online. But for instance, in the group stuff, that's where this is really taking off, where teachers and kids are building their own instruments. They're then integrating the instruments they build with the acoustic instruments they're playing, or they're singing, or they're going in and playing with arrangements and doing that. So another side of this, related particularly to the multi-tracks in that, is that how can we create opportunities and online tools that engage kids creatively with what they're working on in class. So some of the projects that we've just started are around, let's say I'm in choir, okay? And that's wonderful. And what happens in those choir classrooms, we barely have any time with our students. And we want to spend that time doing what we can only uniquely do together in those settings. But could we provide access to the songs we're singing in an interactive format to engage with outside? How often are we taking times like, I think about, there are some really exemplary large ensemble conductors that walk through their process of being a conductor and their process of analyzing, involve the students in that. But oftentimes, there's this pressure because of the small amount of time we have with our kids to get to that performance and get to that high quality thing. But we could have all sorts of interesting inquiry-based music analysis things that happen around that song we're singing outside, where they're analyzing the form and they're playing around with it and they're getting into the parts to where, I can now hear what the altos are singing because I can solo them. And I can just bring up the alto part and I can sing my part along with it. So I look at it more in complementary. Certainly there's going to be settings like, I can imagine we're starting some discussions where we would have science elective courses in performing arts schools around Makey. But maybe we would have music electives in science and STEM schools around this. So I think it could go in a lot of different ways. It could spawn courses specifically around this, where you're designing instruments and you're playing and you're working with that. It also could be technologies that support traditional music making and learning. And I don't value one over another. It's seeing what the possibilities are and then trying them out and design them with actual teachers in those environments and kids to see what works, and then refining the tools.
I have two questions
Yeah.
actually. First one, I'm curious to know, obviously, this is a music forum, so we all appreciate the importance of music. Have you had any personal experiences with people who may even ask the question, who are sort of STEM committed says, that's the question, why bother with music? How do you respond to that?
I haven't necessarily run into that extreme, but not far away from that extreme. And I mean, this is something that the National Science Foundation has recognized, that traditional ways of teaching in STEM subjects do not engage everybody. Or at least the way it's traditionally taught in a number of public schools does not necessarily engage everybody. So they're looking at what are alternative ways that we can particularly develop interesting curricula and pedagogies for engaging underrepresented minorities, everybody in general. And one of the, there's a number of projects out there. There's one called Artbotics, which is art and robotics, that blends those together. And there's art performatics, music plus computational thinking work. But we're seeing that it's really engaging quite a diversity. And they continue to fund it. So there's growing evidence that music and the arts can be engaging contexts to explore that, because there are natural connections in acoustics and in physics and waveforms and things like that, and it doesn't have to be that. Now, one interesting thing that I'm seeing with educators is that when I bring this to music teachers in Ireland or UK or Australia, they are all over it. And one of the reasons is because there's not, in general, they're not music specialists. The primary generalist classroom teacher is teaching music. And so the person responsible for teaching music in elementary also is responsible for teaching math and science and social studies and English. And so they're very interested in finding interdisciplinary ways of connecting, to teach musical content, to teach that together. Whereas in environments, particularly in the US, where you have a music specialist, and there's often very little communication in some cases between the music teacher and the rest of the teachers. They're seen as the special that happens outside in some schools. We have such limited time, we want to resist that because we want to preserve the amount of time to teach the musical experience that we want to have, because we value that and the kids value it. So it's really finding those spaces. A lot of this development work in STEM, particularly Scratch, was most successful in after-school programs because it didn't run into the constraints, because there's even resistance to Scratch in schools by STEM teachers, because they have to teach life cycle and biology and chemistry and things. They aren't there to teach computing. That's not on the test. Even though it could be a wonderful environment for modeling physical environments and testing things and building animations and doing things like that. Again, it takes a teacher that's willing to kind of engage in that, and a culture of the school that's willing to support it.
Absolutely. And if I may ask the second question,
Yeah.
I was just wondering a bit about devil's advocate.
Please.
And it's like, these are wonderful initiatives, and it's all very appreciating them. I was wondering whether you also recognize the risk of possibly pushing people to understand music as living in some kind of virtual computer reality. How would you motivate a student to also pick up a physical violin?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a big enough tent of people interested in music, and there's a big enough hole. I mean, to me, the two musical roles that are most invisible to the general populace are that of the music producer and that of the engineer. They're behind the glass, even in the process. I mean, even musicians sitting in on sessions really don't know what happens behind the glass in there, in many cases. And so I think I have a lot of agency in bringing those creative processes to this. I mean, my example for this and why it's important to the acoustic musician, for example, is an example that was shared to me by Simon Zagorski-Thomas from the UK. The great example he uses is Britney Spears recording "Oops, I Did It Again." And the fascinating thing about it with her voice is that Max Martin, here you have 17, 18-year-old Britney Spears, and he's trying to get this sound out of her that's very gritty and mature. And how do you take that voice and get that? Well, it turns out, he adds a low-pass filter to cut out some of the high frequencies to that. But then, if you listen to "Oops, I Did It Again," particularly the opening, the story is that he took a sample from a Yamaha keyboard of a Wiro. A Wiro. The instrument with the ribs. And if you listen to it, underneath her voice and keywords, there's actually underneath it. It's like, oops, I did it again. I played it, etc. That's what it was. And so you have this huge populace of young girls trying to sing like Britney Spears. Yet what they're doing is destroying their voice because it's impossible to cut off those high frequencies and have a weirdo in their throat. So that's an example that I lead with teachers to show the importance of this, because if they don't know that and their kids are singing and trying to match these vocal timbres, they might hurt their voice. So it's really important to know the processes that engineers and producers bring to that so that we have an idea of what that is, so we aren't hurting our acoustic sound or that. I mean, it could be listening to a very processed, bright violin sound, and how am I going to get that? But even being able to recognize these timbral effects. I mean, we have so far to go on that. So that's one response.
I think we should